Hi, welcome back to my channel. My name is Manon, and today I kind of want to talk about classic literature because this year I kind of wanted to read a lot more classic books, classic literature, and throughout the year I was kind of reading it and I thought, like, what exactly is it? Who chooses it? And like, where does it even come from? Because some of them I love and I think are great, and some of them I just don't get it. So I did a bit of research and I thought, why not take you along with me for kind of very briefly of what I learned about that. Okay, so let's start off with kind of the definition of classic literature. It is important to note that there is a difference between classic literature and classical literature. And classical literature mainly focuses or solely focuses on works from like Greek, Roman, and other ancient civilizations that are works during those time periods, where classic literature is, especially in time, a much broader concept. Hence, that has more work from the times after all of those civilizations kind of went down. Obviously, there are books that are in classical literature that are also in classic. Think the Odysseys, for example. So yeah, I'm gonna solely talk about classic literature. Classic literature is a book that has longevity, influence at a time or still to this day, has appeal, and meets common high standards for quality. Okay, so this statement often kind of shows that's kind of vague. All of the words are kind of very free of interpretation, so we're gonna just look at some of the words on its own to see what they mean. And the first one is longevity, and it kind of shows that the story or the book itself is still being read years and years later. It's kind of on the fence how long it is. Somewhere I read 100 years, others a few generations. I think right now the rule of thumb is kind of, if it's after World War II, it's a modern classic. If it's before that or during, it's considered a classic. Most importantly, to note about this is that longevity mostly talks about how it's still considered a good body of work even years and years down the line. So the story itself could very much encapsulate a story of the time period and of what was considered normal at that time, and therefore might not fully relate to you and this day and age. The second thing we're going to talk about is influence, and that is very simply said about how it has influenced other works, and maybe not even just books or literature, but also other art forms. And maybe it was also influenced by other books, so you can see that back in the story and also recognize how that original story, that classic, has influenced others after that. Think about maybe movies that were made or shows or, art pieces, paintings, whatever. If that piece of work is influencing a lot of other art forms and has a lot of influence, it is far more likely to be considered a classic. The next word we're going to talk about is appeal, and this is we're just kind of talking about how many people enjoy the story, which also showcases why a lot of the classic literature books are talking about very overarching big themes like life and death, love or religion, because a lot of people deal with this throughout their life, and therefore are stories that appeal to a broader audience. And also appeal has to do with like being appealing to multiple generations, whether it's at the same time or throughout your own life. Think about when you maybe read a book when you're a teen and you take out very different things than when you read it again when you're an adult. Like you maybe see multiple layers to it, or just find other things that work for you. Think about this, for example, we're talking about like the Toy Story movie. When you watch it as a kid, you find certain jokes really funny and you don't always see others. Then you watch it as an adult and you kind of get some of the innuendos they're doing. The last word we're going to talk about is quality, and this relates for part to the body of work itself, like the technical terms, how it's set up and the construction of it, and for a part also about the artistic quality. And that looks different in every day and age. Like nowadays, there might be books that we wouldn't read as willingly and were like be as big of a bestseller was at a time due to changing of average spacing in books or differences in language. And therefore, that part is very much tied to its time. So looking at this definition and figuring out a little bit more of the words, we can say that it's all narrowed down a little bit more on the amount of books, but there's still a really big group left, and they can't all end up in the 100 best books or greatest books of all time. So, or can be even considered like classic literature. So I did some more digging and I found a research paper by Tim Lacey. In the research paper, they describe it as such: idealized collection of books, both ancient and modern, believed worthy of repeated reading. This kind of showcases also that, again, it's a very vague concept, and also showcases why there are a lot of different lists out there for great books. And even if you would ask now people like modern classics, who would end up being like a big classic for writers that maybe are still alive nowadays, you'll get different answers. If you ask someone who is a great romance reader and loves them, is more likely to say The Notebook by Nicholas Sparks, where someone who loves reading horror stories might mention like It by Stephen King. Neither of them are bad, but it showcases that repeated reading and appeal and what influences you or what kind of things you watch are vastly important into what could be considered a classic. Interest and appeal and wanting to read something multiple times or think is worthy of that is actually very personal taste. So that begs the question, is like, why did we start making these lists? Who chose them? And the size, even at that time when it started, which books would be chosen? Okay, so this brings us to the next part as to like why we started making these lists, and we kind of can date it slightly back to the 1880s, 1890s, where these lists slowly started coming up, and then we mostly look at the US. It quickly got taken over by the UK, and then kind of spread itself across Western world. I don't really know how it goes in other countries, but the research paper by Tim Lacey specifically stated this. But if we look at those things of like the US, they did it because a lot of the university electives were working with that. That was different and new, and they were kind of looking at how to handle that. And also, the publishing industry was going through this major boom. Like, it was growing, and a lot more people were reading and looking for books that they wanted to read. And just also ask and have questions like, which book should I read? What is something that is worth my time? And by kind of combining all those things, it came to be that sometimes scholars or professors, but also publishing houses or newspapers gave out small lists of like the greatest books of time, or these are the classics, or these are the books you should read in your life. And that kind of morphed or got into the question of like, what exactly are the greatest books? Which books should people really read at least once in their life? And this was kind of a question that kept growing, especially in the literary world. When we're talking publishers, we're talking scholars, we're talking, writers themselves who wanted to know which books they should recommend. What's the ultimate list? And through this process, there became sort of lists start happening, especially like very late 19th century. And a lot of the lists did fall into the category that Arnold mentioned, which is the somewhat vague principle by Matthew Arnold is that the books on this list had to offer the best which has been said and thought in the world. This principle was kind of a look into what Arnold and his supporters wanted. They wanted to create a democratized culture in which every individual in the society was infused with culture, which on its own is kind of a vague concept, but that they, through education and inspiration of books and other art forms, they would, keep what was good in Western culture and also then go along with the modern day. So like keep the good and strive for better in the modern changes. So a lot of lists were more and more about quality and education, and also in kind of enticing people, although that seemed to fall more back. But yeah, the lists were supposed to be there to bring the cream of the crop, to educate, to create a society, to create partially democratic culture and really bring out the best, and that's what people should be reading. And I think you can guess in reality that didn't really happen because the publishing industry is still very dependent on its consumers, the average reader, and as much as some of them could enjoy these books, the reality is that sometimes there are books that were immensely popular that would not be considered educational or filled with culture. And I think if you look at modern day, an example of that is 50 Shades of Grey. To say that it's very educational or, infused with culture, I think we can all agree that's kind of not the case, but it was immensely popular and no one can deny that. So therefore it showcased, and that's happened not just now, but happened then a lot too, where there were really popular books that just would never be considered one of the greats by the literary field. It's also good to understand that a lot of the lists that we looked at, or earlier lists, considered a lot of non-fiction or just works that were vastly important into the culture that they had at their time. I also think it's like, and who chose them is basically people in the literary field, which stock scholars, professors, publishing houses, and also very much the reader. When they decided what they wanted to read was also of influence of what was considered a good book. For example, a classic that we can adopt at that time was considered not good is like Dracula, which even now we all know the story. There are so many plays and books and movies either of Dracula or very much inspired by them, which also relates to the longevity. It may have not started out as, but if it keeps going for multiple generations and we still read it and enjoy it and even never gain popularity, it would still be very much up for classics. And this book also showcases that some of the stories or books will not fit into all categories that I mentioned in the previous definition. There are definitely books that don't have super high quality, but because they were the first of their kind to do so, or first in their genre, they still had a very big influence on. And that goes with every single aspect that I meant. The point I was trying to make is that it is important to look at who chose them, because ultimately we're talking late 19th century, early 20th, and these groups still lived in a very specific part within society. And it just begs the question of like how many people, like who were the readers and who were they? Because the reality is that probably not a lot of people of color had access to libraries or how much their voice was even listened to at the time. And if a lot of the scholars or intellectuals were, white, then how much appeal is a story gonna have that is way out of their worldview or whatever is? And it's important to note that even although there was a side there, even if we're looking at today, the people that have access to books and the intellectuals, and that goes to people who go to university study, but also people who just read, and even high school students who have to read classics, how much more diverse it is and how the makeup has significantly changed to, over 100 years ago. So that's why I always see why a lot of the classics could be updated, to say it, and why you shouldn't hold on to it away as much, because ultimately that wasn't the point of classics. They were there to educate and entice people to keep reading. And if there's no book in this list or in this thing that is there for you and for you to recognize yourself in, and that doesn't entice you or educate you to keep reading, then it's kind of missing the point. And this is not me saying that classics are good. Some of them are amazing. And yeah, on personal taste, I won't like every single one of them. And that's the same for everyone else. But if we stick to the original idea that was behind it and admit to the fact that choosing classics is a vague concept that is even still debated about till this day, we can all just assume that there's nothing wrong with disliking classics. Also recognizing that these lists are also as beneficial as lacking, and therefore I think classic is, again, a great concept, but doing this research and hopefully you, again, I hope it helps out a bit with reading classics. I think for me personally, I'm gonna look at them somewhat differently. But yeah, so I think there will be more enjoyment, but I won't be as hung up on it anymore. So I think for next year, which is kind of soon to say, but I don't think I'm gonna make it a goal for myself anymore. I just want to read books that I love, and I don't want to exclude them just simply to what comes out very recently, but also books that have been out for years and generations and that people love. And yeah, that's kind of my conclusion. So I'll see you guys again next week. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!